So we're continuing this series called The Story. And again, what we're doing is we're working our way from Genesis through Revelation. And it's a 31-week study. We're going to be taking breaks here and there throughout the year, like we're going to be starting to break next week with Easter. But we're trying to hit the highlights from the Bible, from Genesis through Revelation. And today we're going to be looking at one of the central characters in the Old Testament. We're looking at the life of David, and really there is more that's been known about David and spoken about David than just about any other character outside of Jesus throughout the Bible. Hundreds and hundreds of books have been written about the life of King David. So if you have your Bibles with you, I hope you do, take your Bibles and turn to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 5. We're going to dive right in there, and maybe you're familiar with this story. Maybe you grew up in Sunday school and you saw the life of David on the flannel graph. I know I did as we grew up through Sunday school. But some of the facts of the story that led up to this chapter. Now, David was just a shepherd off in the hills, wandering his flock, taking care of his flock. And this prophet guy, Samuel, comes along and he anoints David to be the next king. Now, you'd think that maybe life was peaches and cream after that, but it really wasn't. David had to face multiple trials. And I believe, like I said earlier in my prayer, that each one of us can learn from these trials that he went through. Now, we talked last week that he fought against the giant Goliath, and he defeated Goliath, and he befriended King Saul. But again, we learned last week that over time, King Saul became incredibly jealous of David, and he threatened his life so much that David had to flee and run from King Saul. Afterwards, he found himself in the wilderness, wandered in the wilderness for years, separated from family and friends, and separated from the kingdom. But what I think is cool is that in the wilderness, early on in David's life, that's where God did a lot of the tremendous work in David's life. You see, it's in the wilderness that David's really at his best. It's where his life gets shaped and defined by God. And while he's in the wilderness, we see the death of Saul, and David now taking his place on the throne. David is now king over all of Israel, and that's a big thing in Israel because Israel wanted a king so desperately. They wanted to be like all the other nations, and we talked about that last week. They wanted to have a king. And the king they had in Saul, if you were going to do a report card, he would probably be like a D-plus king that they had in Saul. But in David, they saw an A-plus kind of king. And now David is on the throne, and Israel was so excited to have him. But keep in mind, okay, throughout all of Israel's history, it was God that made himself available to be Israel's one and only king. And again, as we saw through the book of Judges, and even through Saul's life, God says, I will be your one true king if you'll let me. But the tragedy of this story is they just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. God just wouldn't do it as their one king. And so now they had David, and their hopes were high for what he might do. And we see David go on this incredible run. So if you just want to breeze through 2 Samuel chapter 5, you should look through it. You'll see in this first part, we see him in this incredible success, in taking back Jerusalem, this chief city in Israel, the head city. David wins this back from their enemies. And in the second part of chapter 5, he defeats the Philistines, and that's their number one enemy, and David defeats them. And he's on this incredible run. And as a part of his victorious campaign, he decides he wants to bring back this Ark of the Covenant to God's city, to Jerusalem. Okay? And this Ark was Israel's most sacred possession. And again, you saw the video of this. Okay? This was where they believed they had to go to worship God. This is the closest thing Israel had for a throne for God. It's where he kind of lives as a reminder, and it helps them in what he's done in their story and what he was going to do. And it was a sacred reminder to them of who God is. And you see, David knew that it needed to be back in Jerusalem. It had been gone for a long time, and David was bringing it back. So if you jump ahead to chapter 6, and you see the first two verses that David, he got a group together. And they went down and they got the ark from the house of Abinadab. And he'd been keeping it safe and sound for the past 30 years during Saul's reign. But after a long journey of carrying the ark, getting this back to Jerusalem, David finally got it back to the city, back to where it belongs. And you saw that the major party broke out. And if you're following your sermon notes, we're going to look at the trials of David. And this is the first trial that he went through, and that is criticism. Criticism. Now again, you think Mardi Gras is a big deal? You have no idea of what went on that day. Because now the Ark of the Covenant is back. God's presence could be felt and seen now by the people of Israel and all throughout Jerusalem. And the party just continued to go on and on and on. But look at 2 Samuel 6, 14 and 15. It says this. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. Now again, this is one incredible party. It says that David worshiped the Lord with all his might. Think about that. With all his might, he worshiped God. And I like the video that we saw, and Richard Gere does a pretty good job here dancing around like that. But this is full body, full contact, no holds barred worship of God. He was just letting it loose for God. And it says a real interesting thing there, okay? It says that he was wearing a linen ephod. Now, what's an ephod? Why is that important? Why does it include this thing about a linen ephod? Well, you might know that an ephod was sort of a sleeveless undergarment that was worn. And it came down about hip length. So there we have David wearing essentially, his underwear. Really. So we have David in his underwear, the king of Israel, dancing with all of his might. With all of his might, worshiping the Lord with complete abandon, with complete disregard for what anybody else might think, including his wife Michal, who was the daughter of Saul. Michal was quite disgusted, okay? She was critical of him and offended to see her husband, the king, dancing around the kingdom all throughout Israel in his underwear. Guys, wives don't like it when you dance around in your underwear. Cindy absolutely hates it when I do that. Rich is thinking, that's a picture I could have went the rest of the day without. But we have Michal here thinking that this is not a good thing for PR. It's not the best thing. This is going to make the morning paper. So she was critical. She was very distressed. She doesn't like it at all. But David doesn't care because he's worshiping God with all of his might. His attention, his focus is on God. It's fixed on the glory of God. He's not worried about criticism from anyone. This trial of criticism. Now, I was thinking about this week, okay? Imagine, Scandinavians, imagine what it would look like to be so free in your worship of God to not care about what the person next to you, what they sound like, or what they look like, or what they think. Not to be caught up in those things, but to just be caught in the wonder and the glory of God. To be willing, like it says there in 6:22, to do what David says here. David says to his wife Michal in verse 22, and let me give you the Jeff paraphrase. Baby, you think this is undignified? I ain't got started yet. That's kind of what he says. That's kind of what he says. I'll even be more undignified than this. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe you grew up like me in a church where, the kind of dancing in church is when you crossed your legs. You stood still, you had your hymnal in your hand, and you looked down and you didn't look up. That's what it was, And guys had their clip-on ties on, and we sang from our hymnals, and that was the proper thing. This is not the picture we have of King David. It's not what I see. Not at all. If you want to see what it means to worship with all your might, get in the car behind my wife Cindy when she's driving, okay? This is great. She's got KFNW on sky loud, and it's going like crazy, and she's singing with all of her might, She really gets into it. I get in her car and turn on the car, and it's like, whoa, she's blasting, But just not care what the car next to you is doing. You're just singing with all your might. To lose sense of what others might think. See, David wasn't worried about that. He was lost in the glory of God, worshiping God with all his might. And I wonder what it might look like, Rick. I wonder what it might look like for Battle Lake Alliance if we worship God together with all of our might. if we solely, Joyce, just focused on God? We might get some criticism. Yikes. We know David, though. He was a man after God's own heart. So I want to ask you a question here about this, okay? Think about David dancing through the streets in his underwear. Now I want you to think about the throne, and specifically the throne of David's heart. When David's dancing through the streets, worshiping God with all his might, who do you think is on the throne of his heart at that moment? Is it God or is it David? I'd guess it was God. God's on the throne of David's heart. God is on the throne. All David sees is worshiping God with all his might. And when it comes to you and I, we gather here and we worship, or when we worship God through the week, who's on the throne of your heart? Are you more concerned about what people might think? Are you more concerned about God? More about you and the experiences you have? Or feeling that God might receive and the experiences He might from worshiping Him with all of our might? Who's on the throne of your heart when you worship God? Is it you or is it God? Something to think about. Well, David continues his incredible worship of God, and his rule is just expanding. And we see here, you skip over to 2 Samuel chapter 9, that David does something that not all too uncommon for kings, but this is forever going to be remembered. Okay, and that leads us to the second trial of David, and that is called conscience. Okay, conscience. Jump ahead to chapter 9, because we see David go on a search for any of Saul's existing relatives. And again, this is not an uncommon thing for kings to do. Oftentimes what they'll do is they'll search for the previous king's relatives, and anybody still left of them, they'll have them killed, because they would represent a challenge, a threat to the throne. And it was really a form of like job security. Just kill off anybody else that might take the throne. But you see, David is searching Saul's relatives because of his conscience and what God is telling him. And David does something else. He has something else in mind, something that can only happen when God is on the throne, when God is speaking to your conscience. We see him searching for Saul's relatives, but not to exact vengeance, but to extend mercy, to extend grace. The Lord speaks to his conscience, and King David remembers the promise that he made to his best friend Jonathan. 2 Samuel 9:3. The king asked, "Is there no one still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba, who was a servant, answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet." And kind of giving a disclaimer about who this person is. "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodabar." So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. Verse 6. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. Now imagine what must have been going through this poor kid's mind when he comes, because he knew what other kings would do. But all of his life, Mephibosheth had lived in exile. And now he's going to be brought before to his grandfather's successor, to David. Now look at verse 6. "Mephibosheth, your servant," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat at my table." I like that. "I will restore to you everything that belonged to the previous king." Now, it was rightfully David's, but he's going to restore it to Mephibosheth. And he gave him this promise: you will always, not just today, but you will always eat at my table. Now that's going to be important a little bit later. But you need to imagine that. Mephibosheth, who by every right should have been killed, and this guy was crippled, and he lived in exile, and now he's being brought before the most powerful guy in the land. And he's being showed mercy, and he's given wealth and a part of the kingdom. And he's invited to sit at the king's table. Now I read that this week, and it reminded me of somebody else. It reminded me of God. Because see, isn't that what God does for us? He invites us in. We're strangers, we're aliens to God, but He invites